Hi guys, Olive here today to discuss Table for Two by Amor Towles. This book was published in 2024 by Viking, which is a part of Penguin Random House. The hardcover copy comes in at 464 pages. However, I read an e-copy that I purchased with my own money. This was written by the author of some very popular novels, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and The Lincoln Highway. Perhaps you have heard of one or more of those, but this is a collection of shorter works of fiction. It's composed of 6 short stories, the majority of which take place in New York City, and then there is one novella that is set in Los Angeles. And the reason why it's titled Table for Two is because of something that Amor Towles said during an interview that he did with his friend Ann Patchett, who is also a novelist. He said that it was brought to his attention, something that all of these shorter works of fiction had in common, was that they all contained a pivotal moment that was set at a table for two. Also in that interview, Amor Towles said that he really likes writing short stories. He has historically written them in between his novels, and something that he's liked to do over the years is bind those short stories into little booklets to then give to family and friends as gifts, which I believe he did with the first short story in this collection because Ann Patchett had read it before. I think she received it as a gift from him. That first short story is called The Line, and more people other than just Ann Patchett got to read it because it was actually first published in the literary magazine Granta back in 2019. It is set in Soviet Russia, and our main character is a man who's not much good at anything besides standing in lines or queues. For anyone out there who is not a Soviet history buff, as I definitely am, at this time in the Soviet Union, the line, the queue, the очередь was ever present because there were pretty much always shortages. People were lining up to receive essential items. I have heard a joke about that period of time that seems much more like truth than humor, which is a very Russian humor thing to do, that if you were walking along and you saw people lining up for something, you got at the back of that line regardless of whether or not you knew what you were standing in line for. But that was very time consuming, just standing around waiting to receive things. So basically, our main character of this short story creates a job for himself, holding people's places in line so that they could go off and do whatever it is they wanted or needed to do. They could go about living their lives and he would hold their place in line. And our main character gets so good at this within the short story that it eventually lands him in New York City. And then we as readers remain there for the remaining 5 short stories in the collection. The first of those remaining short stories in New York City, meaning the second story in this collection, is called The Ballad of Timothy Tuchet. And it's about a young man who has very lofty literary ambitions, but he just doesn't have the writing skill of his literary idols. What he does have a knack for, however, is recreating the signatures of those literary idols, which is something that a bookstore owner notices and decides to take full advantage of. There's definitely something very reminiscent of Can You Ever Forgive Me by Lee Israel about this one. It also reminded me a lot of Once Upon a Tome by Oliver Darkshire, which is a memoir of a bookseller at a rare bookshop in London. I actually reviewed it here on my channel if you're interested. But The Ballad of Timothy Tuchet, it's a tragic yet oddly humorous and definitely very bookish tale. The third story is Hasta Luego, in which 2 men become friendly at an airport as they're waiting for their flights, and then they decide to stick together after both of their flights are canceled because of foul weather. And then one of them is tasked by an outside source with looking after the other one after a secret is revealed. Now, that might not sound all that exciting. This one is probably the most boring to just describe, to give a synopsis of, but this one is actually incredibly touching, and it has stayed with me probably more than any other story in this collection. Fourth is I Will Survive, which is another story with a secret at the center. A daughter is asked by her mother to track her stepfather one afternoon. Her mother has recently found out that her husband is not being entirely honest about his whereabouts on certain afternoons, so the mother asks her daughter to follow him to see where he goes. But at the very last minute, the mother changes her mind. She tells the daughter, scrap the plan, don't do it after all. But the daughter is now interested. She almost can't help herself, so she does it anyway. And that has a quietly devastating results. This one is kind of the opposite of Hasta Luego in that it sounds really juicy from that description I just gave, but it's probably my least favorite of the entire collection because it left my mind almost immediately after I finished reading it. At number 5 is The Bootlegger, which Amor Towles told Ann Patchett in that interview I was talking about. It's rooted in an experience that he had at one point in his life. In this short story, we see a husband and wife essentially get persuaded into buying a series of tickets for performances at Carnegie Hall. So they have the same 2 seats for the entire series. They sit there every single time, and every time they go, they notice they're seated next to a little old man. He has the same seat every time as well. And they notice that it looks like he's recording the performances, which is strictly forbidden. The very lawful husband is incensed by this. He gets increasingly angry after every single performance, and during one performance, he decides he's going to do something about it. And eventually, he comes to wish he didn't. This is another one with a lot of tragedy in it, and there's a lot to chew on in this one. There's a lot to think about after you're done reading. And then finally, the first half of the book, the short story half of the book, concludes with the 6th story, The Di Domenico Fragment, which was actually released as an Audible original back in 2021. Our main character is a part of this extended family in which later generations inherit increasingly smaller pieces of this Renaissance painting that was owned by one of their predecessors. That way, no one person in the family inherits the entire painting. They all inherit little pieces of it. Our main character sold his piece a very long time ago, but he once again finds himself in rough financial shape. And when he's approached by someone who wants to buy a fragment, he gets back in touch with some family members of his under false pretenses. They think he wants to connect with them and be part of the family, when really he wants to broker the sale of their fragment in exchange for a finder's fee. This was a pretty entertaining story. It has a very satisfying conclusion, but it's one of my least favorites of the collection. But then the second half of Table for Two is a roughly 200-page novella called Eve in Hollywood. And it's essentially a sequel to Amor Towles' first novel, Rules of Civility, which, if you don't know anything about me, just so happens to be my all-time favorite book. Fiction or nonfiction, it is my number 1 favorite book. I reread it every single June. As of the time I'm filming this video, I've read it a total of 9 times. It will be 10 times when I read it again in June. I wouldn't say this about any other book out there, and I've read a lot. I may be the world's number 1 fan of Rules of Civility. I can't imagine there's anyone out there who loves it as much as me, who's read it as many times as I have, who's championed it like I have. I think I am the world's number 1 fan of Rules of Civility. So, hearing that there was going to be a sequel was obviously very exciting. However, something I suspected about this sequel when I first heard that there was going to be a novella within this collection that had something to do with rules was that I had already read it, which turned out to be partially true. What I read a number of years back turned out to be an early draft of what would go on to become Eve in Hollywood within this collection. Now, I didn't read that because I have some sort of insider connection at the publisher that lets me get my hands on early copies of Amor Towles' work. I wish I did. Maybe at this point I should, because I think I've probably convinced thousands of people to read Rules of Civility at this point. I actually had Amor Towles DM me at one point on Instagram to thank me for how hard I go for rules. I have no idea how he heard of me, but apparently if you scream about a book online loudly enough and for long enough, the author eventually notices. I read the early version of Eve in Hollywood because I've been on the internet long enough, because I've been dedicated to rules for such a long time, that I first heard of Eve in Hollywood back when it was sold as a 60-ish page Penguin special. It was only available on ebook. It came out in 2013, but I read it for the first time in 2016, right after I had reread Rules of Civility for the first time. And it was then that I realized that it was definitely my favorite book. So shortly after that reread, I read the little 60-page version of Eve in Hollywood. And I would tell you what I thought of it back then, but since I have this ability, because I am a dinosaur here on BookTube, Let's go back in time. I'll let 2016 Olive tell you what she thought of it.
This is a kind of a spin-off of a book. It is an extension of Rules of Civility, which I reread in June and of course love. Since it is a spin-off and takes place after some of the events in Rules of Civility, I can't say a ton about it, but it does follow the character of Eve Ross, who was not my favorite character in Rules of Civility, but there is just something about Amor Towles' writing that captivates me right from the beginning of any story that he's telling. Every character has so much personality, and Amor Towles has to spend zero effort in explaining to you what they're like because you can tell just from their behavior, just by the way that he's writing them. He really keeps description to a minimum. He lets you picture things yourself. His writing is just artful. I always want more of it. 5 stars for this one. The only thing I didn't like was that it wasn't a full-length novel.
So what good luck for me now, 8 years later, that Amor Towles at a certain point withdrew from the publisher that early version and decided to expand upon it. And I'm really glad that he cleared that up because it actually solves a mystery that has been bothering me, legitimately bothering me for years now. At a certain point, I don't remember when, but I noticed that even Hollywood wasn't available for sale anymore. It's still on my Nook. I still have my early version of it because I purchased it, but it was just gone at a certain point. You could no longer buy it, and I always wondered why. Well, thank God Amor Towles has finally cleared that up for me. I no longer have that nagging at me. He said that he felt like he didn't do the character of Eve Ross justice in that really short version, and he wanted to go back and do something about that. So for a period of time, Amor Towles actually moved into the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles, where a good chunk of this novella takes place, and he got to work editing and more than doubling the page count of that early version of the story, and he turned it into the novella that we find within Table for Two. Eve Ross, who is one of the 3 primary characters of Rules of Civility, finds herself in Los Angeles, and she becomes friends with the actress Olivia de Havilland. Those are 2 facts that we already knew about, first from an aside from Rules of Civility, but then also those 2 things were a part of the early version of the story. But in this novella, Amor Towles added a mystery heist angle as Eve and several friends that she makes during her short time in the city are all on a mission to protect Miss de Havilland's reputation as she gears up to film Gone with the Wind. Eve Ross is a sensational character. She is from the moment you meet her in Rules. I can see why Amor Towles wanted to give her more attention. I mean, she's charming. She's deceptively intelligent. How intelligent she is will surprise you because she doesn't show her hand right away anyway. And she's also drop-dead gorgeous. Like, she is a leading lady. She deserves her own story, and I'm really glad she got one. Now that I've read it, I can tell you it is entertaining, it's elegant, and thus it follows in the footsteps of Rules quite nicely. It is best read, however, after you have already read Rules of Civility, the entire novel. Could you read them the other way around? Technically, yes. I think if you read the novella first, you're gonna fall in love with the character of Eve. It's going to make you want more of her, and thus you'll want to read Rules if you never have before. But a few things from Rules are revealed pretty casually in the novella, including a huge reveal, so some things will be spoiled for you if you go in that direction. It's for that reason that I advise that you read Rules of Civility before taking on the novella, or even give it a reread if it's been a while since you read Rules for the first time. And I say that for your benefit and mine. I think it'll be helpful to have it fresh in your mind. But I say that also for my benefit, because I think Rules of Civility is one of those novels that you can only realize how brilliant it is after you've read it more than once. I myself did not realize how brilliant it was, how impressive it was, how much I personally loved it until I had read it twice. It did not become my favorite book until after the second time I read it, because you pick up on so much more the second time through. You pick up on tiny details that you never noticed before after every single read through. I am still noticing new things about Rules, and I've been reading it for just about a decade. Because I know ROC so intimately, though, I have to say I was pretty perplexed by Eve's character motivations in this novella. I mean, she goes to pretty extreme lengths. She puts herself in danger, all to protect the reputation of Olivia de Havilland, whom she doesn't know all that well. She met her fairly recently. And Eve's character, as I know her, as I understand her, which I feel like I do pretty well at this point, it's not that she's a bad friend. She's just one of those people. She's a much breezier figure in the lives of people she cares about. She'll kind of float in and out of your life. She's just a hard one to pin down. It doesn't mean she doesn't love people. It doesn't mean she's not a good friend. It just means that she's not going to be that friend who stands beside you during everything. So seeing her turn into this ride or die for an acquaintance felt rather abrupt and out of character, especially when you realize that Eve has just left her very best friend back in New York City. I'm bothered by two more things that I thought I would briefly mention. The first is the fact that I've now paid for Eve in Hollywood twice. I paid for that original iteration back in 2016. Now I have paid for the updated version here. And for those of you out there who are even more dedicated to Amor Towles than I am, if you bought that Audible original of the Di Domenico fragments, and then you buy this collection, you're getting even less new material for your money. I'm not entirely opposed to authors re-releasing previously published material. I think especially if that work has been published in something that requires a subscription that not everyone has access to, has funds to subscribe to. If you then take that work after a period of time and release it and charge for it, I don't have any problem with that at all. But it is a little bit weird when authors release something once, charge for it, and then put it out again and charge for it all over again. I just don't love that. Obviously, even Hollywood is a unique case because it has been substantially updated. So charging for it again, I don't feel cheated. It just feels a little bit strange now having paid for this story 2 different times, and I still haven't gotten a full novel out of it, which you heard me yearning for back in 2016. Then there's the fact that even Hollywood feels so oddly placed in this collection. When I first heard that Amor Towles had a new book coming out that expanded the world of Rules of Civility, I thought that meant that everything in this book, all of the short stories and the novella, would find their roots in Rules of Civility, that all of them would branch out from rules in different ways. And that didn't feel far-fetched to imagine because there are character connections to Rules of Civility in both of his later novels, in A Gentleman in Moscow and in The Lincoln Highway. And I heard that all of the short stories took place in New York City, which is where Rules of Civility takes place. So, like a fool, I guess, I went into the first short story, The Line, which is set in Soviet Russia, thinking that there would probably be some sort of a connection to the character of Katie Content, the main character of Rules, because she is of Russian descent. I thought maybe the main character of that story would be related to her in some way, but that didn't end up being the case. And as I read the rest of the short stories, I realized that none of them were going to have anything to do with Rules. Once I got over that initial wave of disappointment, I was able to just appreciate these short stories for what they were, and I really enjoyed them. As I said all the way back in 2016, Amor Towles has this talent for getting you invested in characters right off the jump. It takes you no time at all to know what they're all about, to feel invested in their stories, and because he has that skill, he has a real talent for short story writing. I thought these were really, really good. It's just I have no idea what they have to do with Eve in Hollywood. The 2 different sections feel very pasted together in a way that lacks artistic intention. I mean, the only thing that the short stories have in common with this novella is that they're all sub-novel length works of fiction. I personally think it would have been so much better if Amor Towles had expanded Eve in Hollywood even more, added even 50 more pages that he could have used to develop that friendship between Eve and Olivia de Havilland much more fully, and that way it would have been a full-length novel. A short novel, which for him is a little unusual, but a novel nonetheless, and then he could have released that. Then, if he had waited until he had more short stories, maybe 4 to 6 more, I'm thinking, thereabouts, then he could have released a collection of just short stories. If he likes writing short stories, if he's writing them in between novels anyway, then he eventually would have ended up with enough to release a full collection. That that way, he could have released Even Hollywood as a novel, as the sequel to Rules of Civility that it is, rather than have it be this weird arm of a confused collection. Table for Two was not a bad read at all. I think it's worth reading. I think it has the same gorgeous writing and deft characterization as you can find in all of his work. It's just that I have objections to the existence of this collection. First, with the ethics of re-releasing material that you've previously charged for, but then also mushing together two unrelated halves is such a strange choice that I think the only way to make it make sense is to have the author have financial motivations. And since there are finances at the core of both of those issues, I have very conflicted feelings about this overall. So those were my very lengthy thoughts on Amor Towles' new book. You had to have known I was going to have a lot of thoughts. This book contains the sequel to my all-time favorite book. I've read all of Amor Towles' work. I have a lot of thoughts about those as well. So of course I was going to have a lot of thoughts about this new one. If you have your own thoughts, I'd love to hear those down in the comment section below. If you want to get your hands on a copy of this new book, I will put links to where you can do so down in the description box below. And at the very bottom of the exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets, like my Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.